Well, thanks so much to the organizers, particularly for placing me right after Mathilde, because I completely agree with a statement that Xavier Le Pichon published in a paper in 1965 that he mentioned yesterday, saying observations should be taken into account in any theory of mid-ocean ridges. So I'm going to try to, at the end of the talk about some fairly simple theories about how magmatism affects mid-ocean ridges. But before I get to mid-ocean ridges, I actually want to talk about massive magmatism and how it might affect continental breakup. And the reason for doing it in this order is actually that I think I can make a point about massive magmatism that's fairly simple. And sort of magmatic processes can get fairly complicated. And what I want to bring up in the latter part of the talk, related to mid-ocean ridges, is moderately complicated. So I probably should first tell you the conclusions before I get into each part of the talk. And the first part of the talk actually has a very simple conclusion, which tries to lay out some of the physics of why massive magmatism may be very important to large-scale continental breakup. So I'll try to make that one simple point with some illustrations and even a little movie of a laboratory demonstration. And then the second part talks about something that builds on what Mathilde was saying, that it's clear along ridges there's variations in the amount of magma, and particularly the amount of magma relative to the thickness of lithosphere at the ridge. So we now have an amazing amount of data constraining the thickness of the crust at mid-ocean ridges in many places. And each point that I'll show in that part of the talk, you can think of as at least €1 million point to get the crustal thickness. We have spreading rates, and I think we can begin to put a little bit of kind of magmatic complexity into models that deals with the variations in the faulting and axial relief at mid-ocean ridges. But I want to start in the first part of the talk focusing on rifting and give it a little bit of a historical context. So Senghor and Burke wrote a wonderful paper back in the 1970s, and based on geologic observations and observations of the distribution and timing of magmatism, they defined what still is often described as two end members of rifting, and one being passive, related to stretching the lithosphere, and the other related to some kind of active process where active meant active mantle upwelling, perhaps doming related to a plume coming into the area. Let's see if I can figure this out. Oh, yeah. So maybe a hot material coming up an area, pushing up, and pushing apart an area, and perhaps intruding a lot of magma. Now this picture here is an area that's been, this is the Red Sea. It's a perspective view from more or less south to north with the water taken away, so it's shaded topographic relief and bathymetry. This is the Afar down here, Ethiopian Plateau, Yemeni Plateau, all the way up. You can barely see the peaks near Sharm el-Sheikh in southern Sinai Peninsula and up into the Gulf of Suez off here. And this area is often pointed to as an area of clear doming. Underneath Ethiopia, you find the lowest seismic velocities in the mantle on Earth today. We have very good dating of the basalts here. It came out very close to 30 million years ago. And there are dikes that radiate away, particularly exposed along the coast of Saudi Arabia, that are a few million years older. There's some that come right into Sinai. But I wanted to bring this up also because I remember in 1985, I was on a field trip just about right here with Xavier Le Pichon. And in discussing this whole idea, we were shown very good structural data indicating that the earliest basins that were formed in that part of the rift had marine sediments. The basalts predate those, but there was no evidence of any doming in the area. And Xavier, I still remember him walking around the field saying, "Doming is dead. Doming is dead." Well, I beg to differ, actually. I think the doming down here may have caused propagation of dikes along distance, along axis. So I'm going to mainly talk today about some simple and some not so simple mechanics related to dike intrusions. This is a wonderful picture from the sequence of 20 dike intrusions that happened in the Krafla region of northern Iceland. This was in September of '77. There was, for about 10 years, there was activity. The scale here is about 10 or 15 kilometers. This is several kilometers. There's little segments that are going with dikes splitting open. And just for people who don't know about dikes, they're tabular or sheet-like intrusions. They're essentially tensile fractures filled with magma. Whoops, how did I go the wrong way? And we generally think about them as being vertical. Technically, they're just at a high angle to any kind of bedding, but I'll mostly think about dikes accommodating extension that break as fractures that are more or less vertical. We know from geologic data in well-eroded areas that some ancient dike swarms clearly radiate away from centers over huge distances. So this is this wonderful compilation of geologic data on dike intrusions done by Ernst and Barger. What I particularly like, what they're showing, I didn't mention this in the caption, but this area within about 500 kilometers of an apparent centralized location, which they're thinking of as being a plume or plume head. This is at 1.3 gigayears. Whoops. This is that the fabric in the dikes indicates vertical flow of magma in this region and then horizontal flow. There's very few places that has this scale of observation. So dikes can go a long way. So that's one reason why I think dikes may have radiated away from Ethiopia and Yemen up all the way to Sinai, 2,000 kilometers away. And just as a little aside, dikes don't always make it to the surface. Like some can make it partway to the surface and make faults. And I show this just so I can show the next picture of one of our organizers, Rick Calais, who is standing right beside one of these beautiful, very, very long faults with a very long aspect ratio. So this is the center of a segment that's variously known as the Dabahu segment or the Mondo Hararo segment of spreading. It's essentially southern Red Sea spreading, but this is in the Afar region of Ethiopia. And this fault is essentially from here to about 20 kilometers north, so north is way off that way. It's more or less uniform opening. Part of this dike sequence or faults that were triggered by dikes opened in one event that we went out to study and put out some GPS instruments on. I guess that was in '06. It was January of '06. Anyway, many people have noted that major rifting events, say the South Atlantic, or where I live right on top of the Palisades Sill as part of the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. And the Karoo was active in the breakup of Africa, Antarctica, and Tendeka Pirana in the breakup of Africa, South America, and more recently, 60 million years ago or less, major events in the far North Atlantic, and then of course, Ethiopia, Yemen, active about 30 million years ago. And in almost every place we have good dating from people like Vincent Cortio that indicates that the large igneous provinces preceded the rifting, but often by a very small amount of time. And I'd mentioned that geologically, Africa was essentially tectonically quiet for about 500 million years until 30 million years ago, and then everything broke loose at the time of the large igneous province. Then in the 70s and 80s, and continuing to now, we have better and better seismic data indicating that large areas adjacent to large igneous provinces along continental margins have these strongly dipping, very bright seismic reflectors. So these two images are multi-channel seismic images. This is one from the east coast of Greenland, and this is one, I guess, from Argentina, from this area of the South Atlantic. Brazil is a little north of here. And you see these beautiful well, these are somewhat interpreted, but these are very strong reflectors. They're sometimes thicker than even 8 or 10 kilometers. And they've been fairly well understood by drilling and just by analogy with structures in other places like Iceland, that these are mainly volcanics. So understanding the extent of these has more than doubled the estimates of the amount of volcanism, or the amount of volcanic material extruded during rifting. And Martin Menzies put this together as maybe the most liberal interpretation of margins that have sort of seaward dipping reflectors or volcanic. Many people are more conservative than this, but certainly where I live up here in New York, where Lamont is located, is right on top of the Camp Province. And Iceland is up in the middle of the far North Atlantic, is still active. And there's certainly very good data along much of this margin, but more questionable under the salt-covered parts of margins, including the Red Sea, where we can't see through the salt very well seismically. So the basic idea, going back to Shengor and Burke really, is that perhaps some kind of hot plume material pushes up an area, puts it under extension, but we can estimate roughly how much uplift you might get, kilometer scale, and how much stress you'd get. And again, based on just those kind of estimates, you can get a guess about how much stress there is, how much total force to open a rift. And it's not clear that there's enough force produced by this topographic uplift to break normal lithosphere. And certainly Africa was pretty normal. So don't worry about these equations. I just wanted to, you can refer to some different papers on this, but just as an illustration, if the vertical stress I'm showing here is being in green, that to slip on a fault, to have tectonic extension with no magma, essentially you have to lower the horizontal stress a huge amount. And it's fairly well quantified. It can vary with the fluid pressure and the friction coefficient, but it's a large amount. Essentially, the opening of a dike, to first order, breaking at the tip of a dike takes almost no stress. So the only thing that's required to keep a dike open is that you have enough stress to keep the magma down. It actually only depends. Magma, if it's low density, wants to go up to the surface. So to keep it down and accommodate plate opening, you need a force that's just enough to keep it down, and it's just related to density contrast. And for reasonable density contrast, the stress you need at a given depth can be far later than the stress required for shear failure on faults. So that's it for the physics of that. And if you apply it just to estimates of the thermal structure and strength structure of old lithosphere, you would estimate in a fairly standard way using a sort of a Brayson-Kolstad approach of thinking about brittle failure in the part that's straight here and ductile failure in the regions of the crust that are warm enough to flow in the mantle. If you add up the sort of area that I've colored in here, you'd get a terrific amount of force. So with increasing lithospheric thickness, the tectonic force level goes up to a huge level. And if you just play games with topography and estimating forces, about 5 of these units may be about all we have. But with magma available, it may be possible to have extension at much lower stress levels. So to illustrate this, to make it a little bit more lively than looking at a couple of equations, I put together a little demonstration. And so I'm hoping the movie will run, but just to give you an idea about how dikes can open at lower stress, I'm going to set up something that is a thin layer of gelatin. Gelatin's elastic and often used as an analog for the lithosphere, something that you can elastically deform. And I've basically put a little 2 pieces of a plexiglass taped together over a little block of wood, essentially. And I've actually oiled the surface of this so that it's almost a frictionless surface. So this side of the lithosphere wants to go this way, this wants to go that way. There's some low stress in that area, but you can leave this gelatin for days and nothing will happen until you start to inject some fluid in. And if you inject fluid, it can break through, and it's low density, it can go to the surface, but it can also split. So I set up this not very sophisticated model. You see, at least I'm somewhat happy with it, apparently. There's the the plexiglass, you can get an idea of scale. There's an American quarter, a little bit bigger than a €2 piece, I think. And here's you can think of this as Africa, and this is North America, if you'd like, or Africa, South America. And then I have my kind of strange supply of magma. So I don't have a plume underneath, I just have magma supplied from the side. And you can have it erupt, but you can also have it propagate along. And let's see if I can get a movie to work on this. Oops, come on, it's got to work. It's very quick, I think. So it comes up, it erupts, it propagates along, and then, come on, there it goes, North America. Oh, come on, Africa never got going. Well, Africa's pretty stationary. Okay, so I thought that was better than digging through lots of equations. And so the result of that incredibly involved experiment was that possibly you can make a case that without massive magmatism, and many people have made this case, but I'm doing it from this little mechanical point of view, it may take massive magmatism to get continental breakup. But I should say, certainly the details of how magma is distributed along axis and how far it goes, those are terribly complicated. But the basic idea is fairly simple. Okay, but I want to spend the remaining time I have focused more on what Matilda's talking about, of mid-ocean ridges. And I must have to shout out to Marie Tharp, who worked at Lamont from 1948 until, I don't know, she retired in the 70s. I met her a few times. She did an amazing amount of work looking at data of sounding lines across the oceans. And she was absolutely the first person to identify axial valleys. And there are famous stories about how she and Bruce Hazen would argued over whether or not she was seeing something real. The first time she identified or believed she had axial valleys, she had 5 lines crossing, giving a valley-like structure. It turned out later, from what we know, 2 of them were oblique lines crossing transform faults or fracture zones. But the other 3 were really mid-ocean ridges, and so she stuck to her guns and definitely deserves more credit than she got at the time. She's gotten a little more credit since then. Died a few years ago. Anyway, she identified these valleys, and as you can see from sort of close-ups of a couple of different places along the mid-Atlantic ridge, different valleys look very different. They have very different patterns of faulting and different relief. So the rest of the talk, I want to try to talk about models, some of which were mentioned by Mathilde, to try to understand why there's the relief there is, why there's the amount of axial valley depth, and of course at some places you have axial highs, so it's the opposite shape, and why you have the pattern of faulting. And if we can understand something about the magmatic input, that we can unite models that get the relief and models that get the faults, because they've been somewhat separate in the past. I should mention that Chris Small, who's also still at Lamont, did a beautiful job analyzing bathymetric profiles from ships crossing at high angles to mid-ocean ridges around the world. And he then estimated the sort of depth of the valleys and height of the highs, and shows this very smooth variation overall with spreading rate. And then there's some big changes south of Australia. There's some very deep spots. And on the Reykjanes Ridge near Iceland, you get some very shallow spots. So there's both clearly a trend, and many people have talked about this, with spreading rate, but also crustal thickness. The Australian Antarctic discordance has very thin crust, and the Reykjanes has very thick crust and has a high. Okay. And also, as Mathilde mentioned, there were different ideas, including viscous head loss that people like Norm Sleep and Art Luckenbrook talked about in the 70s. But Franchetot and Tavernier in 79 were really the first to say, no, it's more related to brittle deformation, the production of a steady-state axial valley. And they produced this wonderful figure. They didn't produce much of a quantitative model, but the idea is there's stretching in this area, producing faults, and somehow pulling the surface down, leading to a valley, but there's no magma in the model. And mid-ocean ridges are the main place that magma comes out of the earth, so it might make some sense to put magma in. And John Chen and Jason Morgan, who's here, did that in the late 80s and published a wonderful paper where not only they dealt very well with the thermal structure of the lithosphere as a function of spreading rate, but they also put in sort of a simulation of magma. But they assumed that dikes opened at the full rate that the plates were spreading, the plate rate, this would be the dike rate, but down to the base of the crust. And the model actually ended up producing essentially no valleys when you had the dikes extending deeper than the base of the crust. And then essentially with lower spreading rate, you got thicker lithosphere and you got deeper valleys. And it's very consistent with data. So here's valley depth versus their model opening rate and real data opening rate. And they got the overall trend. But this model, it turns out, does not produce faults. So, oops. And there's fantastic data from a number of places. And Matilda's done a great deal of this work, quantifying that there's several different ways that that faults tend to happen at ridges. There's fairly symmetric breaking. There's this very asymmetric breaking that produces core complexes or detachments. And then there's the more complicated chaotic or multiple detachments back and forth that she was talking about. And of course, you do, for very fast spreading, you can get axial highs. So there's just a picture, just to be complete, of a nice axial high on a little bit vertical exaggeration of 15 versus 5 for a particularly regular symmetrically faulted mid-ocean ridge, and then a classic core complex at the Kane transform right here. And here's the transform here, the fracture zone here, and here are these beautiful Kane megamullion or corrugated core complexes. So these are thought to be fault surfaces that have tens of kilometers of offset, whereas the faults associated with axial highs tend to be tens of meters, with more symmetric spreading maybe 1,000 meters, and now tens of thousands of meters. Okay, so I got into this with a couple of colleagues, one of whom, Luc Lavier, is from France, but now is in Texas, and Alexei Polyakov from Russia. And we decided to think about the problem of if we had dikes that went all the way through the lithosphere, since if they only went part way through, there should be a stress concentration, and dikes are pulled into areas of low stress. And we tried to then say, okay, what we're going to vary is not the thickness so much. Well, we are varying the amount of magma coming in, so the overall thickness of the crust, but we're varying essentially the rate of opening of these. So it's a very simple kinematic model, but the rate of widening of the dike can be lower than the rate of widening of the whole plate system. And we define the ratio between those velocities as m, sort of the fraction of magma, or the fraction of the plate spreading that's accommodated by magmatic dikes. That's how you can think of it. Anyway, and it worked pretty well up to a point. It worked well for the faulting problem. So with that very simple kinematic treatment, applying it in a numerical model that's very similar to the Chen and Morgan model and to their thermal model, just with that little change in the geometry of the kinematically applied dike, we could get an axial high and even bending faults that were somewhat the same amplitude as what was seen. Here's some data from, I guess that's 9 north on the East Pacific rise. And this M number was 1 for this, so we're accommodating all the plate spreading in a very thin plate with magma. Then we had a thicker plate at the axis, so this is scale here, so 7 or 8 kilometers, and we had a dike in the middle, but now accommodating only 95% of the spreading. We got these beautiful symmetric model faults that again were somewhat like some places. This is a very symmetric spot. It's a little faster spreading than we were sort of simulating here, so the scale's a little different. And when we dropped M to 0.5, we got these beautiful large faults, very much like the Kane faults, the other oceanic core complexes. So we were quite happy to explain the kind of modes of faulting that are seen. In later work, we even, at lower values of M, got a more chaotic pattern. But we completely failed on the axial relief. So we're at an impasse now. The Chen and Morgan model takes care of the axial valleys, the axial relief, and this little slightly changed model takes care of the faulting. and they don't match up. The moment you set the rate of dike widening lower than 1 by this number, or lower than the total spreading, you always get a deep valley, and the valley is as deep as it can be for the strength structure of the axis. It gets dropped down until essentially it can't get any deeper, and it pops up at the sides. So it's what we call tectonic control. So we got a buoyancy control related to the density structure, and then a deep valley related to the strength structure, and nothing in between. And everybody who saw our model said, well, it's great for faults, but boy, it only gives axial highs, or you change things a little bit, bam, it gives you very deep valleys. And we see everything in between, even along particular segments of a ridge. So it's a pretty bad failure. Now here's the complicated physics that I don't have time to go into in detail. So you'll have to read, there's a paper on this out last month in EPSL. But the thing that we talked about, so I guess I can explain it for a minute. So if you think of the lithosphere in gray here, I guess, it's not well labeled on this, and below the lithosphere you might think more ductile region. So that little model where I had gelatin, you can think of this as gelatin, and underneath it you can think of having something like high viscosity syrup, or maybe silicone putty, like silly putty. So if you had very strong, maybe this is better to think of this as rubber. You can stretch this rubber on the inner dike period and get big stresses, but underneath it, the silly putty is getting no stress buildup at all, because it's taking you tens of years or 100 years to build up these stresses. But dikes break on timescales of seconds to minutes to hours, which the silly putty then doesn't look like a viscous fluid. It looks like an elastic material, a brittle elastic material. So essentially, when you break through, when you have magma that can say it's coming down the axis of the ridge, hitting that part of stressed material, it breaks through there. But the stress that's being relieved in the top actually induces stresses in that lower layer. And many people have worked on this, Dave Pollard and Vertman and others, that you can then have propagation of a fluid crack into an area of initially no stress, because you produce stresses when you rip open the area. And you can have a fair amount of material that goes into this deeper area, and it should solidify slowly and contribute to the gabbros of the lower crust. But the interesting little extra piece of physics that goes into this is that the deeper the valley gets, the deeper you put the top of the dike, the less material goes into the deep part of the dike. I can't go into this. The equations are all worked out in this paper. But it gives us the right kind of behavior now to link these two kinds of models. Because now, essentially, our problem before was that this little ratio m, if it was less than 1, if we kept it constant at less than 1, we always had to have faulting that always got things deeper until things got as deep as they could get. But now, we have a mechanism that says, if I have a certain total amount of magma to come in, if I put less magma into the deep area, into making the gabbros, more can go into making the dikes, I can get deep enough that I can actually accommodate all the spreading, and I'll still maintain the valley. So essentially, M now depends on valley depth. And if it hits 1, the system stops deepening. So, okay, I know that's kind of fast, but I don't have a ton of time. But putting it in context, I mean, before we had a model that said, when you had plenty of magma, maybe a magma lens, everything floats up as high as it can, and you can end up with an axial high. When you have very little magma, and you can never get enough magma to accommodate things, the valley deepens until faults have to accommodate a certain amount of the spreading and keep the valley deep. But we're saying that in between, with this sort of transition from if you had a high, m being less than 1, to having then enough magma to accommodate spreading, you can stop deepening before you get to this tectonic limit that we see. So we put together a numerical model that includes dike opening and even magma lenses, and we can then produce for different, essentially, crustal thicknesses and or spreading rates. We can sort of, and different starting cases with different crustal thicknesses. We start with different values of m, and we can go to a point of essentially m equals 1 with very little relief, moderate relief, and eventually big faults. If in this intermediate case, we do often see small faults in valleys like this. So we can also put a little oscillation in the magmatism and produce faults. But we can produce essentially just varying crustal thickness and spreading rate. We can make axial valleys sort of symmetrically faulted, but magmatically controlled. We put a little oscillation in the magmatism to get little faults. We can get symmetric faults also when m is a little less than 1. And then when m is staying less than 1, we can get either detachment faults or the more chaotic pattern. And so we can look at every place in the world. I'm running out of time, but I'll go over the last couple of slides very quickly. So these are the only places in the world where we have good seismic data on mid-ocean ridges, and we have control on the spreading rate, shown by the size of the circles here, and this is the valley depth, shown in colors. And here the size of the circles are the crustal thickness, thick here, very thin there. But anyway, the takeaway is this model can predict the whole range of observed axial relief as functions of crustal thickness and spreading rate, saying it's tectonically controlled or magmatically controlled over most of the ocean basins. And then it also gets the faulting pattern more or less right. So the colors of the dots here are whether it's symmetric or non-symmetric faulting or detachment faulting or chaotic faulting. So to sum up, essentially, with a somewhat more complicated treatment of intrusion of dikes, we can actually fit the full range of both observations. Thank you very much.